The most dangerous person in the room is rarely the one raising their voice. By 7 o'clock on Friday evening, the elegant dining room of Beaumont House had already begun to unravel. Crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of chandeliers. A grand piano filled the air with soft jazz, and Manhattan glittered beyond the towering windows. Yet none of the guests paid attention to the beautiful surroundings anymore. Every conversation had shifted toward one table near the center of the restaurant. Nathan Brooks was back. The billionaire founder of Brooks Holdings had earned a reputation that spread through New York's finest restaurants long before he ever walked through their doors. He never shouted. He never insulted anyone. He never created a public scene. Somehow, that made him even more intimidating. He simply asked impossible questions, noticed every tiny mistake, and quietly requested another server whenever someone failed to meet his expectations. Within 15 minutes of his arrival, the first waitress returned to the service station fighting back tears after forgetting a detail about the wine pairing. 10 minutes later, another experienced server admitted she could not continue after Nathan politely questioned the ingredients of a seasonal sauce with such precision that she froze in silence. A third waitress lasted barely 5 minutes before asking the restaurant manager to assign someone else. None of them had been humiliated. None of them had been treated unfairly. Yet every one of them left his table convinced they were simply not good enough. The tension spread through the restaurant like a storm cloud. Customers whispered while servers avoided looking toward Nathan's table. Even the kitchen staff began checking every plate twice before sending it into the dining room. Richard Collins, the restaurant manager, loosened his tie and rubbed his forehead as he studied the reservation chart. "I cannot keep asking people to walk into that," he muttered under his breath. Several servers quietly pretended to organize silverware rather than volunteer. Others suddenly found reasons to disappear into the kitchen. Then, from the opposite side of the room, a calm voice broke the silence. "I will take his table." Every head turned at once. Claire Foster stood beside the coffee station carrying a polished silver tray against one hip. At 28 years old, she had worked at Beaumont House for nearly 3 years, yet she never attracted attention. Guests remembered her kindness more than her face. She moved through the dining room with quiet confidence, remembered birthdays without writing them down, and somehow noticed empty glasses before customers realized they needed refilling. Richard looked genuinely concerned. "Claire, you do not have to do this." She smiled gently. "Someone has to. You have heard the stories." "I have. 3 servers already asked to leave that table tonight." Claire adjusted the cuff of her white shirt beneath her black apron. "Then they probably needed a break." Richard lowered his voice. "Nathan Brooks is different." Claire nodded. "He is still a guest." Richard searched her face for signs of nervousness, but found none. She looked neither fearless nor overconfident. She simply looked prepared to do her job. "If he asks for another server?" Richard asked. Claire offered the smallest smile. "Then I will thank him for the opportunity and wish him a pleasant evening." One of the younger servers whispered, "How is she so calm?" Another quietly answered, "She is always like that." Claire picked up a fresh bottle of sparkling water, straightened the folded linen napkin on her arm, and began walking toward the table everyone else had spent the evening avoiding. The conversations throughout the restaurant gradually faded as if someone had lowered the volume of the entire room. Even the pianist glanced briefly across the dining hall before returning his attention to the keys. Nathan Brooks looked up from the leather-bound menu just as Claire stopped beside the table. His expression revealed nothing. Calm blue eyes studied her with the same careful attention that had unsettled every waitress before her. Claire met his gaze with a warm professional smile. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks. My name is Claire, and I will be taking care of you tonight. May I begin by pouring your sparkling water?" Nathan closed the menu without answering immediately. Instead, he looked directly into her eyes for several quiet seconds. Around the restaurant, employees held their breath without realizing it. They had all seen this moment before. The impossible customer had found another waitress. What none of them knew was that this would be the last ordinary moment either of them would experience that evening. For what felt like an eternity, Nathan Brooks simply watched her. He did not reach for his glass. He did not answer her greeting. Instead, his attention lingered on every detail with the quiet precision that had already unsettled 3 experienced waitresses that evening. Claire stood patiently, the bottle of sparkling water resting lightly in her hand, her posture relaxed, her expression warm but never forced. She had learned long ago that silence often revealed more about a person than words ever could. Finally, Nathan spoke. "Before you pour anything," he said calmly, "tell me something." Claire nodded. "Of course, sir." He closed the menu and folded his hands on the white linen tablecloth. "What is tonight's chef recommendation?" Claire answered without hesitation. "Pan-seared Chilean sea bass with roasted fennel, heirloom tomatoes, citrus beurre blanc, and a side of grilled asparagus. It is our most requested entree this evening." Nathan's expression remained unchanged. "Did you taste it?" Several nearby servers glanced toward the table. It was another unexpected question. Claire shook her head honestly. "No, sir." Nathan tilted his head slightly. "Then why would you recommend something you have never tasted?" A younger server standing near the service station quietly closed her eyes, convinced the conversation was about to follow the same pattern as the others. Claire never appeared flustered. "Because my recommendation is based on what our guests consistently enjoy, the ingredients prepared by our chef, and the feedback we have received throughout the evening. If you would rather hear my personal preference, I would recommend the herb-roasted chicken because I appreciate balanced flavors that do not compete with one another." Nathan looked at her for another moment. "So, your first answer was based on data?" "Yes, sir." "And your second answer?" "Personal judgment." Nathan nodded almost imperceptibly. "Interesting." Claire gently poured the sparkling water into his crystal glass without spilling a single drop. "Would you like a few more minutes with the menu?" Nathan did not answer the question directly. "How long have you worked here?" "Nearly 3 years." "Have you always been a waitress?" "No, sir." She offered nothing more. Nathan noticed the deliberate restraint. Most people volunteered unnecessary details. Claire answered only what had been asked. "What did you do before this?" he continued. Claire smiled politely. "I had different responsibilities." Nathan almost smiled himself. "You answer questions carefully." "I try to answer them honestly." The corners of Nathan's mouth lifted just enough for Claire to notice. It was the closest anyone had seen him come to smiling all evening. "Very well," he said. "I will have the herb-roasted chicken." Claire wrote nothing down. "Would you like the vegetables prepared as listed on the menu, or would you prefer the seasonal mushrooms instead?" Nathan looked up with mild surprise. "The mushrooms. Excellent choice. You remembered that option without checking?" "Yes, sir." Nathan leaned back slightly. "Impressive memory." Claire answered with quiet humility. "Remembering details is part of taking good care of people." Before she could leave, Nathan asked another question. "Tell me something else." Claire stopped. "Yes, sir." "Why did the other servers leave my table?" The restaurant seemed to grow quieter once again. Claire considered the question for only a brief moment. "I cannot speak for someone else's experience." Nathan studied her expression. "Then speak for yours." Claire met his eyes without hesitation. "So far, I have only met a guest who asks thoughtful questions." Nathan remained silent. "You do not think I am difficult?" he finally asked. Claire smiled gently. "I think you expect people to care about their work." Nathan watched her closely. "Most people call me demanding." Claire folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. "High standards are not the same as disrespect. The difference is how we treat people while expecting excellence." For the first time that evening, Nathan Brooks found himself without an immediate reply. Around the dining room, several employees quietly looked toward one another. They had expected another waitress to walk away defeated. Instead, they were witnessing something entirely different. Claire had not challenged the billionaire. She had not tried to impress him. She had simply answered with calm honesty, and somehow, every response seemed to make Nathan less interested in testing her and more interested in understanding the person standing before him. Claire turned gracefully toward the kitchen to place Nathan's order, but before she had taken 3 steps, his calm voice stopped her once again. "Miss Foster." She turned immediately. "Yes, sir." Nathan rested one hand lightly against the edge of the table. "One more question." Claire returned without the slightest sign of impatience. "Of course." Nathan looked toward the large dining room surrounding them. Couples celebrated anniversaries beneath soft golden lights. Business partners quietly discussed contracts over expensive bottles of wine. A family near the window laughed as a little girl proudly showed her parents the dessert she had chosen. Then Nathan looked back at Claire. "Tell me what you notice." She blinked once, surprised by the unusual request. "About the dining room?" "Everything." Nearby employees quietly exchanged nervous glances. Another impossible question had arrived. Claire slowly allowed her eyes to travel around the restaurant. She did not rush. She simply observed. After several seconds, she answered. Table 12 is celebrating a birthday because there is a wrapped gift hidden beneath the chair instead of sitting on the table. The gentleman near the fireplace is left-handed because he moved his water glass before touching his bread. The elderly couple by the window have probably been married for decades because they stopped reading the menus at the exact same moment without speaking to one another. The little girl in the corner is pretending not to like vegetables because she has already eaten every carrot on her mother's plate while everyone else was talking. Nathan looked toward each table she mentioned. Every observation was correct. Even the nearby servers slowly turned their heads, quietly confirming what Claire had somehow noticed while continuing to work. Nathan folded his hands together. You pay attention. Claire smiled softly. People usually tell us what they need before they ever speak. Nathan asked another question. Then what do I need? Several employees nearly stopped breathing. Claire did not answer immediately. She looked at the untouched menu, the perfectly aligned silverware, the leather notebook beside his plate, and finally at the expression he had carried since entering the restaurant. I think, she said gently, you want consistency. Nathan remained silent. Claire continued. Not perfection. Consistency. You ask detailed questions because you want to know whether people truly understand their work or whether they are simply repeating memorized answers. Nathan leaned back slowly. And what makes you believe that? Claire answered without hesitation. Because every question you have asked me tonight has had more than one correct answer. You have never tested my memory. You have only tested my reasoning. For the first time that evening, Nathan's composed expression shifted into genuine surprise. He had asked similar questions in boardrooms filled with executives earning seven-figure salaries, and very few had recognized the purpose behind them. Yet a waitress standing in a black apron had understood his pattern after only a few minutes. Around the restaurant, whispers quietly spread among the staff. Richard Collins watched from the service station, unable to look away. He had expected another uncomfortable exchange. Instead, the conversation had become strangely respectful, almost like two experienced professionals quietly exploring how each other thought. Nathan rested his elbows lightly on the table. Has anyone ever told you that you ask yourself better questions than most people ask others? Claire laughed softly, the first genuine laugh Nathan had heard from her all evening. No, sir. They should. She lowered her eyes for a moment before replying. Good questions usually come from listening longer than speaking. Nathan slowly nodded, almost to himself. The answer stayed with him longer than he expected. Throughout his career, countless people had tried to impress him by talking more. Claire had done the opposite. She listened first, observed second, and spoke only when her words could genuinely help. As she finally turned toward the kitchen once again, Nathan realized something he had never experienced in any restaurant before. He was no longer interested in evaluating the waitress serving his dinner. Instead, he found himself quietly hoping that the conversation would continue long after the meal itself had ended. When Claire returned from the kitchen a few minutes later, the atmosphere around Nathan's table had changed in a way that everyone in the restaurant could feel, but no one could explain. She carefully placed the herb-roasted chicken before him, making certain the seasonal mushrooms were arranged exactly as requested. The aroma of fresh rosemary, roasted garlic, and butter drifted gently across the table. Nathan thanked her with a slight nod before picking up his fork. Claire remained nearby just long enough to ensure everything was satisfactory. Nathan took one measured bite and quietly set his fork back on the plate. Several employees instinctively looked toward the table. They had seen this moment many times before. This was usually when another request followed. Nathan looked up. May I ask you something else? Claire smiled politely. Certainly, sir. He gestured toward the beautifully prepared entree. What would you improve? A nearby server nearly dropped a tray. It was another impossible question. No one expected a waitress to criticize the chef's signature dish, especially not in one of the city's finest restaurants. Claire considered the plate carefully before speaking. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the colors, the ingredients, and the portions with thoughtful attention. May I answer honestly? She asked. Nathan nodded. That is the only kind of answer I enjoy. Claire folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. The food is prepared exceptionally well. The seasoning is balanced, the vegetables are perfectly cooked, and the presentation reflects great care. Nathan waited. However, she continued gently. I believe the plate tells only one story. Nathan leaned forward with interest. Explain. Claire pointed discreetly toward the roasted mushrooms. Everything here speaks of precision. Every ingredient has been carefully controlled. Every color has been intentionally arranged. It is beautiful. She smiled softly. But beauty can sometimes become predictable. Nathan remained completely focused. What would you change? Claire answered with quiet confidence. I would add one unexpected seasonal ingredient that reminds the guest they are eating something created by a person, not a formula. Perhaps roasted wild chanterelles gathered this week, or a small garnish that changes with the local harvest. Something that cannot be copied exactly every night. Nathan looked down at the plate again. Around the dining room, even Richard Collins found himself listening from across the room. Claire continued. People remember consistency because it builds trust. They remember small surprises because they create emotion. The best experiences give us both. Nathan slowly smiled, this time without hesitation. You are not talking about food anymore. Claire smiled back. Not entirely. Nathan rested his fork on the edge of the plate. You are describing leadership. Claire gave a slight nod. The principle is similar. Nathan laughed quietly, a sound that immediately caught the attention of several employees. It was genuine. It carried no sarcasm, no challenge, and no hidden test. Richard blinked in disbelief. In all the years Nathan Brooks had visited Beaumont House, no one could remember hearing him laugh during dinner service. Nathan looked back at Claire. Tell me something honestly. Of course. Have you studied business? Claire hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. I have spent time learning about many subjects. Nathan noticed the careful wording again. She neither confirmed nor denied the question. She simply refused to exaggerate or diminish herself. That alone fascinated him. Before Claire stepped away, Nathan spoke once more. Miss Foster. She turned. Yes, sir. The three waitresses before you believe they had failed tonight. Claire listened quietly. Nathan looked around the restaurant before continuing. Perhaps they only assumed I was looking for perfection. Claire's expression softened. Were you? Nathan looked at her for several thoughtful seconds. Then he slowly shook his head. No. His voice became almost reflective. I think I have been looking for someone willing to think instead of simply trying to please me. Claire offered the same calm smile that had remained unchanged since the beginning of the evening. Then I hope you enjoy your dinner, Mr. Brooks. She walked away without waiting for praise or acknowledgement, returning to another table where an elderly couple needed fresh coffee. Nathan watched her for several quiet moments before glancing back at the beautifully prepared meal in front of him. For the first time in years, he realized that the most memorable part of his dinner had never been the food. It had been the conversation with a woman whose greatest strength was not that she always had the right answers, but that she understood the questions people rarely admitted they were truly asking. The rest of the dining room seemed to fade into the background as the evening quietly unfolded. Nathan finished his meal at an unhurried pace, occasionally glancing toward Claire as she moved effortlessly from one table to another. What surprised him most was not her intelligence anymore. It was her consistency. She treated every guest exactly the same way. A young couple celebrating their engagement received the same careful attention as an elderly man dining alone. A family with two energetic children received the same patience that she had shown him. She remembered names, noticed small details, and somehow anticipated requests before anyone needed to ask. Nothing about her behavior changed because one of the wealthiest men in America happened to be sitting in her section. Nathan found that increasingly unusual. Throughout his career, people adjusted themselves the moment they recognized his name. Some became nervous. Others became eager to impress him. A few became overly familiar, hoping a pleasant conversation might open unexpected doors. Claire had done none of those things. She simply continued being exactly who she had been from the moment she introduced herself. Richard Collins quietly approached Nathan's table after the dinner plates had been cleared away. Good evening, Mr. Brooks. I hope everything met your expectations. Nathan looked up with an expression Richard had never seen before. Everything exceeded them. Richard smiled with visible relief. I am very glad to hear that. Nathan glanced across the dining room, where Claire was carefully helping an elderly gentleman into his coat before returning to another table. How long has Claire worked here? Richard followed his gaze. Just under 3 years. Has she always been like this? Richard smiled without hesitation. Every single day. Nathan rested one arm on the table. You trust her? Richard laughed softly. Mr. Brooks, if I had 10 employees like Claire Foster, I would probably sleep better every night. Nathan listened without interrupting. Richard continued. She trains our newest staff members. She volunteers to cover extra shifts whenever someone has a family emergency. Guests ask for her by name. More importantly, every employee here knows they can depend on her. Nathan noticed something genuine in Richard's voice. It was admiration earned through years of watching someone quietly serve others without asking for recognition. Has she ever wanted to become a manager? Nathan asked. Richard's smile became thoughtful. I have offered the position twice. Nathan looked surprised. She refused. Richard nodded. Both times. Why? Richard glanced toward Claire once again before lowering his voice. She said titles only matter if they allow you to help people better. At the time, she believed she could make a greater difference exactly where she was. Nathan slowly leaned back in his chair. The answer sounded remarkably similar to everything Claire had said throughout the evening. There was no contradiction between her words and her actions. They belonged to the same person. Richard excused himself to greet another guest, leaving Nathan alone with his thoughts. Moments later, Claire returned carrying a small silver tray with freshly brewed coffee. Would you care for coffee this evening, Mr. Brooks? She asked warmly. Nathan nodded. Please. She poured the dark coffee carefully into his cup before placing a small pitcher of cream beside it. Anything else? Nathan looked at the steam slowly rising from the porcelain cup. Actually, yes. Claire waited patiently. Nathan spoke more quietly than before. Earlier you said people usually reveal what they need before they speak. Yes, sir. What have I revealed tonight? Claire considered the question carefully. She did not answer immediately, and Nathan appreciated that. She never rushed simply to fill silence. Finally, she looked at him with the same calm honesty she had shown all evening. I think you have spent many years surrounded by people trying to satisfy your expectations. Nathan remained completely still. Claire continued gently. Perhaps that is why you ask so many questions. You are hoping to find someone who answers because they believe what they are saying, not because they think it is what you want to hear. Nathan lowered his eyes toward the coffee cup for several quiet seconds. There was no defensiveness in his expression, only reflection. When he finally looked up again, something subtle had changed. The businessman who had entered Beaumont House searching for flaws now seemed far more interested in discovering truth. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he had begun to suspect that the most valuable lesson of the evening had nothing to do with exceptional service and everything to do with the remarkable woman quietly standing beside his table. Claire noticed the thoughtful silence that followed her answer and gave Nathan the space to reflect without filling the moment with unnecessary words. She gently placed the cream pitcher beside his cup, wished him an enjoyable evening, and quietly moved toward another table where a family had just been seated. Nathan watched her walk away, not because she demanded attention, but because she never seemed to seek it. That difference lingered in his mind. Around him, Beaumont House gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. The pianist shifted into a slower melody, conversations resumed, and the kitchen doors opened and closed with practiced precision. Yet Nathan found himself paying less attention to the elegant restaurant and more attention to the woman moving effortlessly through it. She greeted every guest with the same calm smile. She remembered a regular customer's favorite tea before he asked. She quietly exchanged a child's spilled napkin without embarrassing the parents. She noticed when an elderly woman seemed cold and discreetly asked another employee to adjust the nearby air vent. None of these gestures were dramatic. Most people never even noticed them. Nathan did. He had spent decades studying patterns because successful investing depended on recognizing them before everyone else. Tonight, he recognized another pattern entirely. Claire never acted for recognition. She acted because she believed small moments mattered. Richard Collins returned to the table carrying the dinner check inside a black leather folder. Whenever you are ready, Mr. Brooks. Nathan accepted it, but did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked toward Richard with genuine curiosity. May I ask you something? Richard smiled. Certainly. Nathan glanced toward Claire once again. Has she ever received formal hospitality training outside this restaurant? Richard looked almost amused by the question. Not that I know of. Then where did she learn all this? Richard folded his hands comfortably in front of him. I honestly do not know. She arrived here 3 years ago, interviewed like everyone else, and quietly became the person everyone depends on. Nathan listened carefully. Richard continued. She never competes with anyone. She never reminds people how capable she is. She simply helps. Nathan looked thoughtful. That is becoming increasingly rare. Richard nodded. There is something else. Nathan waited. Every new employee spends at least 1 week training beside Claire. Not because she is required to teach them, but because every manager agrees that she demonstrates what professionalism actually looks like. Nathan smiled faintly. Without a management title. Exactly. Richard laughed softly. Sometimes leadership arrives long before the promotion does. Those words stayed with Nathan even after Richard excused himself. Leadership arrives long before the promotion does. He repeated the sentence quietly in his mind while absent-mindedly stirring his coffee. It reminded him of the earliest years of Brooks Holdings, when he had worked beside people who cared more about solving problems than collecting titles. Somewhere along the way, success had gradually surrounded him with impressive resumes, polished presentations, and carefully rehearsed conversations. Tonight felt refreshingly different. His thoughts were interrupted when Claire approached one final time carrying a small dessert plate. The chef asked me to bring this to you, she said. Nathan looked down. It was a simple slice of warm apple tart with vanilla bean ice cream. I did not order dessert. Claire smiled gently. You did not. The chef wanted to thank you for your thoughtful comments about the menu. He said good questions help everyone improve. Nathan looked at the dessert, then back at Claire. Please thank him for me. She nodded. I will. Nathan paused before she could leave. Miss Foster. She turned with the same patient expression. Yes, sir. You seem unusually comfortable admitting when you do not know something. Claire smiled with quiet sincerity. Because pretending to know everything is the fastest way to stop learning. Nathan looked at her for several seconds before slowly nodding. It was such a simple sentence, yet it struck him with unexpected force. Throughout his career, he had rewarded confidence, celebrated certainty, and expected decisive answers. Standing before him was someone equally confident in saying she still had more to learn. As Claire walked away once more, Nathan realized that the evening had quietly transformed into something he had never anticipated. He had entered Beaumont House expecting excellent service. Instead, he had encountered a kind of wisdom that could not be measured by titles, resumes, or wealth, and for the first time in many years that realization left him genuinely curious about the story Claire Foster had chosen not to tell. The evening finally drew to a close as the last guests slowly gathered their coats and disappeared into the cool Manhattan night. Beaumont House became quieter with every passing minute. Candles burned lower. The pianist played one final melody before closing the piano lid, and employees began resetting the dining room for another busy day ahead. Nathan remained seated a little longer than usual, his untouched coffee now cool beside him. For reasons he could not fully explain, he was not ready to leave. Claire returned carrying the black leather check folder and placed it gently beside his cup. Whenever you are ready, Mr. Brooks. Nathan looked up. Thank you, Claire. It was the first time he had used her first name all evening. She noticed, but her expression did not change. It was my pleasure. Nathan opened the folder, signed the receipt, and quietly placed his credit card inside. Then he paused. Instead of closing it, he reached into his wallet and removed several crisp $100 bills before sliding them beneath the receipt. Claire glanced down only briefly before looking back at him. That is very generous. Nathan smiled faintly. It is well deserved. Claire gently closed the folder and pushed it back toward him. I appreciate the thought, but I cannot accept that amount. Nathan looked genuinely surprised. Why not? She answered calmly. Because gratitude and obligation should never be confused. Nathan studied her expression carefully. You believe accepting it would create an obligation? Claire nodded once. People often believe large gifts purchase access, loyalty, or influence. I would rather leave tonight knowing we simply had an honest conversation. Nathan leaned back thoughtfully. You think I would expect something in return? Claire smiled with quiet kindness. No, I think you would not. But I also believe principles should not depend on the character of the person standing in front of us. Otherwise, they are not really principles. Her answer settled over the empty dining room with remarkable weight. Nathan slowly withdrew the bills and placed them back inside his wallet without the slightest sign of offense. Instead, he looked almost relieved. Very few people have ever declined my generosity. Claire answered softly. Sometimes the greatest kindness is allowing someone to keep their independence. Nathan closed the check folder and stood from the table. Around them, employees quietly polished glasses and folded fresh linen napkins, careful not to interrupt the conversation. Nathan slipped on his tailored navy jacket before turning back toward Claire. May I ask you one final question? Of course. Are you always this certain about what matters? Claire looked toward the tall windows where thousands of city lights shimmered against the dark sky. She seemed to choose her words with care. Not always. Nathan waited patiently. Life has changed my opinions many times, she continued. But every difficult season has taught me to hold more tightly to my values than to my circumstances. Nathan remained silent, absorbing every word. Claire smiled gently. Circumstances have a way of changing. Character should not. Nathan let out a slow breath. During decades of negotiating billion-dollar agreements, he had heard countless speeches about leadership, success, and excellence. Yet none of them had stayed with him as deeply as a handful of quiet conversations inside a restaurant. He extended his hand. Claire accepted the handshake naturally. There was no hesitation and no performance. Just mutual respect. Thank you for tonight, Nathan said sincerely. I believe I learned more than I expected. Claire released his hand and smiled warmly. Sometimes we all do. Nathan walked toward the front entrance, but before stepping outside, he glanced back one final time. Claire had already returned to helping another employee organize tomorrow's reservations, laughing softly at something a coworker had said as though the evening had been completely ordinary. She had not paused to celebrate impressing a billionaire. She had not asked for recognition. She had simply gone back to helping the people around her. Nathan stepped into the cool night air, carrying something far more valuable than an excellent meal. For the first time in many years, he found himself wondering not how successful a person appeared, but what quiet strengths they carried that the world had never bothered to notice. That question stayed with him all the way home, and before the night was over, it inspired a decision that would quietly change both of their lives. The following Monday morning, Nathan Brooks arrived at Brooks Holdings headquarters earlier than anyone expected. The executive floor overlooking Manhattan was still quiet, as sunlight stretched across polished marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows. Instead of opening the financial reports waiting neatly on his desk, he placed a simple handwritten note beside them. Claire Foster, Beaumont House. Find out who she really is. His executive assistant, Michael Harris, entered carrying the day's meeting schedule. Nathan slid the note across the desk. I need a background report. Michael glanced at the name. Potential executive recruit. Nathan paused before answering. Not exactly. Business partner? Nathan smiled faintly. Not that either. Michael looked puzzled. Then what should I be looking for? Nathan leaned back thoughtfully. I met someone who thinks differently than almost everyone I have ever interviewed. I would like to understand why. Michael nodded and quietly left the office. Nathan turned toward the windows, remembering every conversation from Friday evening. None of Claire's answers had sounded rehearsed. None had been designed to impress him. They reflected something much deeper than intelligence. They reflected experience. 2 days later, Michael returned carrying a slim blue folder. This took longer than expected. Nathan accepted it with quiet curiosity. Why? Because there is almost nothing public about her. Nathan opened the first page. Claire Foster, 28 years old. Resident of Manhattan. Employment verified at Beaumont House for nearly 3 years. No public interviews. No significant social media activity. No business ownership. No lawsuits. No unusual financial history. Everything appeared remarkably ordinary. Nathan frowned slightly. There has to be more. Michael nodded. There is. He opened another section of the file. She attended Columbia Business School after receiving academic scholarships throughout college. Nathan looked up immediately. Business school. Michael nodded again. Top 5% of her class before she unexpectedly withdrew during her final year. Nathan continued reading. Academic excellence. National Investment Case competition finalist. Faculty recommendations describing exceptional analytical ability. Leadership awards. Mentoring programs. Every page painted the picture of someone preparing for a remarkable career. Then the record simply stopped. Nathan turned another page. There was no graduation date, no corporate employment, no Wall Street internship after her withdrawal, only restaurant work beginning several months later. Do we know why she left? Nathan asked quietly. Michael hesitated. We could only verify part of the story. Nathan waited. Her mother became seriously ill during Claire's final year. Medical appointments became frequent. Financial pressure increased. She withdrew from school to become her primary caregiver while supporting the household. Nathan slowly closed the folder for a moment without speaking. Michael continued softly. Several professors described her as one of the brightest students they had ever taught. One even wrote that she possessed an unusual ability to understand both financial systems and human behavior at the same time. Nathan remembered Claire's observation inside the restaurant. People usually tell us what they need before they ever speak. Suddenly, the sentence carried even greater meaning. Michael placed one final document on the desk. There is something else. Nathan looked down. It was a recommendation letter written years earlier by one of Claire's professors. Near the bottom, a single sentence had been highlighted by the research team. Claire Foster has the rare ability to make complex decisions feel deeply human without sacrificing intellectual rigor. Nathan quietly read the sentence twice before setting the letter aside. Everything he had witnessed at Beaumont House suddenly made perfect sense. Claire had never been pretending to understand leadership, observation, or decision-making. She had spent years studying them before life interrupted the future everyone else expected her to have. Nathan stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city below. Thousands of people hurried along sidewalks chasing promotions, titles, and opportunities. Somewhere among them, Claire was probably preparing another dining room for another evening of serving strangers with the same quiet excellence she had shown him. Nathan realized something that unsettled him in the best possible way. The world had looked at Claire Foster and seen only a waitress. He had finally begun to see the remarkable woman behind the apron. And for the first time since they had met, he knew exactly why he needed to return to Beaumont House. Not to test her, not to reward her, but to offer something built entirely on the respect she had quietly earned. 3 evenings later, Nathan Brooks returned to Beaumont House without reserving the private dining room and without inviting a single business associate. For the first time in years, he wanted a dinner without negotiations, quarterly reports, or strategic conversations. He requested a quiet table by the window and waited patiently until Claire Foster approached with the same composed smile that had remained unchanged since the night they first met. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks," she said warmly. "Welcome back." Nathan stood politely as she arrived. "Good evening, Claire." She handed him the menu. "May I bring you sparkling water?" Nathan smiled. "Only if you promise not to let me ask too many difficult questions before dinner." Claire laughed softly. "I cannot promise that. You may surprise yourself." The familiar warmth of her answer immediately dissolved the formal distance that had existed between them. After the meal was served and the evening rush began to slow, Nathan looked toward Claire once more. "Would you have a few minutes after your shift?" Claire studied his expression carefully before answering. "I believe I can." Nearly an hour later, after the final guests had departed, they sat together on the small terrace behind the restaurant where soft lights illuminated the quiet Manhattan evening. Autumn. Air carried the scent of fresh rain, while distant traffic blended into a peaceful background. Nathan placed a slim leather folder on the table between them, but made no effort to slide it toward her. "Before I show you this," he began, "there is something I need to say." Claire listened quietly. Nathan took a slow breath. "The night we met, I believed I was testing another waitress." He shook his head with a faint smile. "The truth is that I was the one being tested, and I did not realize it until I left." Claire remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I asked questions because I thought I understood how to recognize talent." He looked directly at her. "You reminded me that wisdom is not measured by titles or offices." Claire smiled gently. "Sometimes life introduces us to lessons before it introduces us to explanations." Nathan nodded before opening the folder. Inside were university records, scholarship documents, and a handwritten letter from one of Claire's former professors. She immediately recognized them. Her expression softened, but she showed no surprise. "You found my story," she said quietly. Nathan answered with complete honesty. "Only the part that could be found on paper." Claire looked toward the city lights for several moments before speaking. "Paper records tell people what happened. They rarely explain why." Nathan carefully closed the folder again. Then I would rather hear the reasons from you someday, if you ever wish to share them. Claire appreciated that answer more than he realized. He had not demanded explanations. He had offered patience. Nathan then removed a second envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. This has nothing to do with charity. Claire looked at him attentively. It is an invitation. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a proposal to establish a financial education initiative through the Brooks Foundation, designed to provide free financial literacy programs for working families, young adults, and students across New York. The final page contained only one request. Program Director, Claire Foster. She looked up in genuine surprise. You are not offering me a corporate position. Nathan smiled. No. Why? Nathan answered without hesitation. Because after learning about your academic record, I realized something important. The world already has enough executives. It needs more people who can help ordinary families understand the decisions that shape their futures. Claire read the proposal once more before quietly closing the folder. You have built an opportunity around what I care about instead of what impresses people. Nathan nodded. That is because you taught me the difference. Claire looked at him with sincere gratitude. Then I would be honored to help. Nathan extended his hand once more. Claire accepted it with the same quiet confidence she had shown from the beginning. Neither of them celebrated with dramatic words or grand promises. They simply shared a moment of mutual respect beneath the city lights. Nearly a year later, hundreds of families would attend the first financial education workshops created through their partnership. Nathan would often sit quietly in the back of the room, listening as Claire transformed complicated financial ideas into practical guidance that changed lives. Whenever someone later asked him where he had found the remarkable woman leading the program, he always answered with the same quiet smile. I did not discover her. I simply stopped overlooking the person everyone else had already decided was ordinary. And that turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made.